evening and welcome to China Exchange. We're a charity based here in Gerrard Street and we aim to encourage people to be more curious about China's influence on the world and through events like this one, bring people to Chinatown for more than just food. Nice to have a laugh. I'm the CEO here, my name's Freya, for those I'm yet to meet. And I have been CEO since 2015, where I have been very used to stepping up in place of the running late Sir David Tang. I admit I am less used to stepping up for the late Sir David Tang, and as many of you will know, our chairman died at the end of August, and how we will miss him. I can see lots of our regulars in the audience. It's nice to see you. 50% of you adored Sir David's irreverent style. And I know from the feedback forms that you are kind enough to complete for us after our events that the other 50% of you perhaps did not. And this Marmite approach to being host was a badge of honor that Sir David wore with pride. Regardless of our views on his style, I'm sure you'll all join me in being very grateful that his friend Sir John Major maintained the commitment to spend the evening with us. Now, it's customary at China Exchange to start the event with asking who is here for the first time. Would you please raise your hands? Welcome. The format for tonight's very simple. 60 minutes with is a clue. Sir John and I will have a conversation, and then you'll be invited to join. There is one rule from Sir David's legacy that I will be maintaining, and that's that we're only going to accept your most intelligent questions. So, Sir John, I know from this audience, partly because they've been pestering us by email for the last month, that they're very curious to ask you about Europe, Brexit. And so because they're so keen to do that, I'm not going to. But I noticed that we've seen all those familiar photos of the current Prime Minister heading off to negotiations, looking very serious, about to negotiate our future in Europe, and that's something to which you can relate. Could you tell us about how you feel when you look at those pictures, and perhaps the memories it evokes from the Maastricht Treaty and the negotiations you led there?
Well, when I see Theresa going off to Europe, I think my main emotion is relief. I remember those meetings with great clarity, but not always with great relief. I'm delighted I'm not doing it. But before I turn to that, let me just say a word or two about David, if I may. I knew David and Lucy for many years. David was, how best to put this, a one-off. I think God took one look at him and decided one was sufficient, and absolutely decided that nobody else was going to be created quite like David Tang, and he certainly wasn't. I don't know how David was typically dressed when he came here, but anything, it could have been absolutely anything from my memories of him. But of all the people I think I've known in my life, David is the one I would pick out who most loved life, who wasted not a single moment in his life. It may not have all been productive, though a great deal of it was. It may have been mischief, and a great deal of it was, but he did not waste a second. And I know he's not here this evening, but I've no doubt if it's at all possible, either up there or down there, he'll certainly be listening in to make sure the questions are appropriately irreverent, as opposed to irrelevant. And I'm promised by Freya that you'll ask extremely good questions, which, after so many years in the House of Commons, I'm not frankly used to. So that might actually be quite difficult. The European Union is a very unusual place to go and negotiate and to go and talk. Most of the negotiations are quite formal. When I was there were only 15 members of the European Union. That was difficult enough to cope with. There are now 28, soon, of course, sadly, to be 27. But a great deal of the meetings were formal. You would sit in a great round table, a subject would be introduced, the other 14 members would say something, and we, the British, would say something different. And at that point, there would be a standoff and we would move on to the next subject where broadly the same thing happened. And it was often outside the meetings that the real negotiations took place. Certainly at the time of Maastricht, that was the case. We would go round the table. The meetings went on for a couple of days and right the way through the night. And there were a whole series of things that we needed to obtain. And if we hadn't have obtained them, I would have blocked the treaty. And I told our European partners that I would do so. It is how we got the opt-out from the single currency, from the social chapter, and that was much misunderstood. The social chapter has a very benevolent sound, doesn't it? It's a lovely name, a social chapter. Who could be against that? But the truth was, the way it was constructed would have been a job-destroying program for this country, which is why I decided that we wouldn't join it. And so they were quite tough negotiations. And I think the negotiations the Prime Minister will have today will be every bit as difficult, and more so, because there is an element of bad blood at the moment between this country and Europe. And the megaphone diplomacy on both sides, it isn't just us. The megaphone diplomacy coming back is no use at all if you're actually going to sit down and negotiate an agreement. The essence of negotiation is that both sides must try and meet, and both sides are going to have to make concessions. And it is absolutely no point whatsoever, if you want a deal, digging yourself in a trench from which you cannot escape without severe embarrassment domestically in the case of the UK, or across Europe in the case of the European Union. So I'm not hugely impressed. I know this is a private meeting and it won't leak. I'm not... It isn't a meeting of the Cabinet, is it? No. I know it's a private meeting and it won't leak, but I'm not hugely impressed with the way the negotiations have gone thus far, and I hope they will become more constructive as we move along.
So you described the experience of being in the trench when really it's bad. When you're in the trench, do you realise you're in the trench, or is it only retrospectively that you realise you're in a position from which it would be very difficult to negotiate?
Oh, crikey, no, you know you're in the trench, all right. And,
how do you know?
And your main concern is whether someone's going to fill it in while you're still in it. And there's often a great tendency to try and do that. No, you know when you're in the trench, all right, because you're facing a phalanx of people opposite. You have a different view and a different objective. And you have to coax them, cajole them, persuade them, bully them sometimes, into reaching a position where you can produce an agreement that you can defend in your own parliament. So yes, you most certainly know. There is nothing indistinct about the differences. They're very, very, very clear-cut, right. Crystal clear, in fact.
So tell us about that moment where you realise you're not in the trench, perhaps the other person is in the trench, and the chinks of light are starting to show, and you start to get the first inkling that you're going to get what you want to deliver.
Well, you usually get that in the back room, to be frank. I mean, I was in and out of the negotiating room on a regular basis, disappearing into a private room with Ruud Lubbers, who was chairing the Maastricht negotiations, or alternatively Helmut Kohl or François Mitterrand, who were the three key people, really. And it was in backstage meetings with them that we really reached an accommodation, where I indicated privately what I might be prepared to concede, and ask them what I expected them to concede. And eventually, we reached a position where both of us felt we could move no further. And we either then decided to disagree, in which case I would have blocked the treaty, or we decided that we could agree, and we went back, and the concessions were made, and we moved on to the next issue, and repeated the same performance.
I'm just imagining what it's like in the major household when there has to be a negotiation about who takes care of something or how certain tasks.
It's very easy, I know my place.
It's very highly honed skills.
If Norma doesn't tell me, Elizabeth will. I don't have any chance at all. They're much tougher than Kohl and Mitterrand.
You heard it here, kids. There's a particular moment, because we are at China Exchange and I am an unashamed China nerd, there's a particular moment that I'm fascinated to hear more from you about. It's rare that we get the chance to explore particular moments in history. Remind me, what year were you made Foreign Secretary?
Oh, crikey, 1989?
89. And which month?
July.
July. So in July that year, you had to go to Paris for some negotiations around Cambodia. There was a peace conference in Cambodia, and it was the first time that you were going to meet with the Chinese minister, Mr. Chen, and you were going to have the very first conversations post-Tiananmen Square about Hong Kong. The first outing as Foreign Secretary, according to the media. So my first question is, was that really the first outing as Foreign Secretary? And two, what did that feel like?
It was the first outing. I had been Foreign Secretary for a whole week. So I was, of course, complete master of the brief on every subject under the sun. And we had this Cambodia Peace Conference after the Khmer Rouge had been murdering a lot of people in Cambodia. And the conference was ostensibly about Cambodia, and of course we discussed that and reached a whole series of important agreements, absolutely none of which I can remember. It was 28 years ago. But I do remember there were two particularly important bilaterals. One was with Jim Baker, then the Secretary of State in the United States, and the other was with Chen Chi-chen, the Foreign Minister of China. And we had a number of things to discuss. It wasn't actually particularly Tiananmen Square that we discussed. What we really discussed was the financing for the new airport at Hong Kong. Because under the, if I remember this correctly, under the 1984 agreement on the transfer of Hong Kong back to China, any large capital expenditures that were likely to go through the periods of the handover had to be agreed with China. And most of our discussion was actually a technical discussion about the release of finance, the agreement by China to release finance in order to build the second airport in Hong Kong. And those of you who remember Hong Kong as it was will understand how important that was, because you used to fly in and practically avoid the washing hanging on the line as you came into the airport. It was a pretty hair-raising experience. And so it was a fairly important discussion. And it, as I recall, went quite well and was the start of a whole series of meetings I had. But then I was only Foreign Secretary for 94 days.
And 94 happy days.
Well, it was a golden era. We invaded no one. We were at war with no one. It was entirely peaceful. And it was only when war broke out in the cabinet between Nigel Lawson and Margaret Thatcher that I left the Foreign Office and became Chancellor of the Exchequer. So it was a relatively brief period as Foreign Secretary, and I've always regretted that, because the world is an extraordinarily interesting place. In the last 20 years, I've spent months every year traveling to almost every corner of the world. And it's extraordinary when you see the world at close quarters, and when you're in the fortunate position that I have been, where you can see senior people in government, senior people in the diplomatic service, senior people in your host country's governments and diplomatic service, and businessmen. And you hear privately what their concerns are in their countries, what their fears are, what their plans are, what their worries are. You do get a very different perspective of the world than the one you get from even the best briefing that you get in the UK, or from the perspective of the UK. The world looks very different from the other side of the world than it does from sitting in your own country. So I have enjoyed that enormously for the last 20 years. I would have enjoyed it had I stayed more than 94 days at the Foreign Office.
So you were made Chancellor. Now, as I understand it, this was a job that you'd coveted from adolescence. Is that right?
Yes, it was always my ambition, if I could, to be Chancellor of the Exchequer.
So how old were you when you decided that Chancellor was the job?
I was 13.
Okay. Now, when I reflect back on being 13, I think it was probably acrobat or circus performer, I'm not really sure.
Well, my father was a circus performer, or a show business performer in music hall. And he was actually, many years before, a trapeze artist when he was a very young man in America. My father, I should say, was 65 when I was born. My mother was surprised. And he had been born in Walsall in 1879, and then as a baby had gone over to America, to Pittsburgh, where my grandfather, who was a master builder, was helping build the Carnegie Steel Works. And so he'd been brought up in America and lived there until he was about 19. I've forgotten why I started talking about that. But
I distracted you by talking about circuses. A lot's been discussed around your background already. I mean, for me, you're the Prime Minister who broke the mold and showed people with a background like mine that we didn't have to go to public school, we didn't have to go to Oxbridge, we didn't have to have terribly well-connected families in business and politics in order to achieve high office. So on behalf of Hayward Comprehensive School, thank you. Thank you for showing us that. It's an area where people talk about what you didn't have, how your background may have hindered or got in the way of your achievements. And I suppose I'd like to hear from you how you felt your background enabled your achievements rather than held you back.
That's quite difficult to talk about publicly because it could so easily be misunderstood. But let me try and explain it. I think a background like mine does give you a drive you wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise. I do think that is true. I don't want to make too much of it because there are millions of people in the circumstances we were living in, but it was a good week in our home when the money didn't run out before the week ran out. And you learn a lot from that, and you're determined to try and change things and avoid what happened. I should say, when I was about 7, my father, who was then in his 70s, which in 1950s was a pretty venerable age, he lost his sight, and he also lost all his money. There wasn't a great deal of it, but we had a small bungalow and a little bit of money, and he lost all of it. And we had to sell the bungalow to pay his debts, and we moved from that bungalow to 2 rooms in a multi-occupied house in Brixton. And we were on the 4th floor. There were 5 of us, except my older brother and sister. There wasn't room for all of us, so my brother lived in a garage where he worked. And my sister delayed her marriage. She was 13 years older than me in order to repay my father's debts. And so it was an unusual background. There were some unusual people in the house. The man who lived on the floor below us turned out to be a cat burglar and was arrested on top of a roof somewhere and spent some years in prison. He was one of the exotic fellow tenants in this particular house. There were 2 boys from Ireland who were there for 6 months in every year because in so doing they could avoid tax in both countries. It seemed to me an interesting piece of financial learning right at the start. And you learn a lot from that sort of background that I wouldn't have learned any other way. And I don't know that that was an inspiration to what one does, but it is certainly a motivation for what one does. And it doesn't go away. You don't forget that. I don't think anybody here will forget their childhood. And they're in a room this size with this number of people, the childhood of everybody will have been different. But whatever it is, it will have left its mark on how you think and how you act and what you wish to do. And it certainly did with me.
Thank you. Thank you for trying to answer a question in a public setting, which maybe was challenging to answer. There's a theme that's been coming up through the talks that we've had here at China Exchange over the past 2 years, and I'd be curious to hear your views on our attention spans and whether the way that we use technology and the way that the media perhaps uses technology affects the way that we think and consume information. You're an expert in public policy, given your career. How does what's happening in the way that social media is adapting, how does that affect the way that public policy gets created, reported, understood?
Well, I'm not the best person in the world to ask about social policy and the social media, well, about the social media.
Do you use Facebook?
Because, no, I don't, most certainly. Good God, no. I regard the quill pen as a dangerously modern invitation. I don't think the social media has helped the proper formulation of public policy. The one thing it seems to me that is missing from politics, and I'm not just talking about this country, I'm talking about right across the Western world, less so I think in the East yet, though it will change, but right across the Western world, the advent of the social media and the speed of reaction to almost anything that is proposed, the speed with which opposition can arise to it, has made the formulation of public policy a great deal more difficult than it used to be. There is one absolutely essential ingredient that politicians should have, but no longer have, and that is time to think. The belief that the moment somebody raises a subject, the politician can sit down and say, that is the solution, and announce it and proceed with it, is absurd. We live in a very complex world, and you need to consider almost everything you do has implications in a whole series of different directions. And the one thing that modern politicians don't have is time to examine all this, consider it, think about it, make mistakes, go back, revisit it, before you actually decide on it, announce it, and implement it. And that means that policy is much more difficult to produce. And because of the social media, it's much more difficult to change. These days, you're not seen as changing policy because you've had a better idea or a wiser thought. You're making a U-turn. And you hadn't thought what you were doing. You made a mistake, so you're changing it. Well, when circumstances change, you change your mind, as Keane said, and circumstances do change. But politicians don't have that option these days. And it is a very great loss to constructive, worthwhile policy making that is the case.
When you were Prime Minister, did you get time to really think and do as much as you'd like?
No, the life of a Prime Minister is absurd. I would, most mornings I would be up by 6, or at least sitting up in bed doing red boxes. I probably wouldn't get to bed till 2 in the morning. The weekdays would be slightly less long, but pretty much the same. The nature of politics is that increasingly decisions go up to the top. They may go up to the top with clear recommendations that you just have to tick off, but not necessarily. And so the amount of decision-making that is pushed up to the Secretary of State and then up to the Prime Minister is extraordinary. And it does mean that he or she has very little time to think. Added to which, unlike many parts of the world, the Prime Minister also has a constituency that they're expected to look after. They have a House of Commons they're expected to be in. They have to answer, in my case, Prime Minister's questions twice a week. They have to address 5 or 6 conferences at least every year. The Conservative Conference, the Women's Conference, the Young Conservative Conference, the Trade Union Conference, and so on. And then a whole range of other things that are fixed points in the diary. You have a whole series of meetings with your ministers. When is the time to sit and reflect? I would dearly have loved some time to sit and reflect before I became Prime Minister, but there was no time because I became Prime Minister over a fortnight in the middle of a parliament. It's maybe a little easier if you've been in opposition and had time to prepare. So I've always felt very strongly that we should give politicians and governments more time and not press them into instant answers. What happens today? You are Prime Minister. And it is Friday afternoon and you are going round on a constituency tour. And the phone rings and it's number 10 saying X has happened. 2 minutes later, or even before you get that phone number, the press who are following you around will ask you a question about it. Not only do you perhaps not even know that whatever it is has happened, you've had no idea, no option to be briefed upon the circumstances of it, or what really was said, or what it might mean, or anything. And you're expected to respond. And if you don't respond, you don't know what's going on. If you do respond, you have a very high probability of saying the wrong thing that you then have to retract, and it's another U-turn. So it does make life extremely difficult. So please be a little more sympathetic to both government and opposition politicians when they're suddenly caught on the hop with often quite complex things that they're expected to be entirely familiar with. because they often can't be.
It sounds ghastly.
No, it's much worse than that.
Now, talking about being on the hop and having time to think, it's now time for our audience to join in the conversation. So please raise your hands. There'll be microphones around with you. So I'd like to come over to, where are we heading? We're heading to Maggie at the back.
Thank you for that. So what was the thinking behind not giving David Wilson another 5-year term and making Chris Patten the last governor of Hong Kong?
Are you David Wilson's son?
No. I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
No. There was nothing particularly behind it except one thought. David Wilson's a very distinguished civil servant, but we were entering into an extremely difficult period with China, with the run-up to the handover of Hong Kong, the number of people in Hong Kong who were concerned at things that did not subsequently happen, but there were many people frightened that the People's Liberation Army would be on the streets the next day, and all sorts of things. And I needed a politician there who could talk to the Chinese leadership, politician to politician, and who, because they knew me well, would have a direct line to me and could just pick up the phone and talk to me at Downing Street, morning, noon, and night. And that was the rationale behind it. Chris Patten was one of my oldest friends. I'd known him for a very long time. When we scraped home in the general election of 1992, he lost his seat. So he was the obvious candidate to put there. He could not have been closer to me. He was someone of immense ability who would be able to talk directly to the Chinese leadership and directly to me. And that was the thinking behind it. So it was nothing derogatory about the abilities of David Wilson at all.
Okay, we're going to head to the back here, and then we'll come to the gentleman at the front.
Hi Freya, hi Sir John.
Hi, Tuck.
Sir John, your energy of patience seems to emanate the room, and I seem to soak it in as I'm listening to you with both of my ears. My question is it possible at all for a human being to be Prime Minister of a country and be consistently kind and be consistently giving unconditionally, or the system itself is designed to not allow these things to be possible, i.e. there's ties that are hidden and not seen from financial forces or conglomerates that revolve around our lives? What are your thoughts?
Well, is it possible for a human being to be Prime Minister? I don't know, it's never been tried. The substance of your question is quite complex. Every Prime Minister I've known has been essentially human. Don't believe behind the facade that they're not. I promise you, however cool, however calculating, however severe in some cases they may see in public, in private, you see a different side of them. They are no different from you. They are just in an extraordinary job. And they have had a background that enables them to cope with the pressures of that job. But they are very human, I do assure you. Is it possible always to put the humanity first? Well, actually, no, it isn't. Because the Prime Minister essentially has two personas. There's the person as he really is. And there's the person who has to make judgments on the basis of the position in which the country finds itself and the circumstances and finances available to the country. Let me give you a practical example. I do actually, but there are many prime ministers I've known who would have loved to do a great deal to make significant changes to the living standards of the people who are at the bottom of the heap, of which there are too many. But without the money to do it, they can't do it. They can't just say, we're going to do it, and it doesn't matter how much extra we tax people, because that affects our competitive structure, and it affects our fiscal balance, and a whole range of other things. So the belief that a prime minister has untrammeled freedom to do whatever he or she wishes isn't true. They're actually quite constrained. And there's a very famous quote and that is even more so if you have a small majority, as is evident on many occasions. But even when you have a big majority, that is so. There's a very famous quote by Douglas Jay, who was a minister in Mr. Attlee's government, a very junior minister in Mr. Attlee's government in 1945. And that government had a socking great majority of over 150. And he wrote that he expected the Prime Minister to be master of all he surveyed. And what he found when he became to know Clement Attlee well was a man who had his own ideas, his own attitudes, but was hemmed in by events, even with a massive majority. So it is not the case that there is total freedom. It's not the case you can always do exactly what you wish. The circumstances, the events of the day, the circumstances of the hour may determine exactly what a Prime Minister can or cannot do.
The circumstances of the hour require us to take a question from the front. Sir.
So, John, you have a very, very long political career. What is the most difficult moment in your career?
Oh, crikey, you have all night? Oh, there have been lots of very difficult things. I mean, not all of them are immediately public. I remember, I'll mention a couple. Obviously, the day we crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism was a political disaster, not an economic disaster, because we were looking for a way to leave the exchange rate mechanism without seeing sterling fall and interest rates rise. And we were overwhelmed by a mountain of selling that had started in Northern Europe, and because of some injudicious remarks made in the Bundesbank, then came on to London. It may have done anyway, but it certainly did then. And so that was extraordinarily difficult politically. But there were other things as well. There were decisions to be made in the first Gulf War that were certainly pertinent. There were silly errors that sometimes happened. I remember on my 50th birthday, which most people celebrate, we were trying to make a relatively minor change in European policy and had every indication that that would be acceptable in Europe. And Douglas Hurd went out with others to make that change, and it wasn't acceptable, and it caused a huge furore in Parliament because it had been widely trailed that we expected to make this change, and then we couldn't. And it was one of those small issues that blow up suddenly out of all proportion. And it was a very bad birthday present indeed. So that wasn't a good moment, but there are many. The truth of the matter is you could probably find one every day. The difference between being a departmental minister and prime minister is that everything ends up on your desk. And because of the sheer scale of it, the easy things don't come to you because they're easy. It's the difficult things where there are disputes, where there are difficulties, when agreement can't be reached that actually come into number 10 for the Prime Minister. So there are very difficult decisions to be made almost on a daily basis. And some go wrong. You may have noticed that.
Hello, Sir John. A lot's been made recently of how the Labour Party has become popular with the young. It's the party of the young, it seems. Do you have a view on what the Conservative Party can or should be doing in order to attract the youth vote? Grassroots activism, online stuff? What do you think the party should do?
Well, that's so complex. It's difficult to tell you in a sentence. There's no silver bullet. There's no single policy that I think will do it. But let me make some suggestions to you. When I was young, a long time ago, I was inspired by one politician that many people here may never have heard of and others may not remember, but some will. A man called Ian MacLeod. Ian MacLeod was not a big man. He was 5'8". He had a paralysis of the neck and a huge bald head, a domed head, and a great voice like a bell. It was like a cathedral bell ringing when he spoke. And he was a brilliant orator. But it wasn't so much how he spoke as what he said. And he talked so often, particularly to young people, about the responsibilities of life that they would inherit rather than the advantages they were going to get. He spoke about the people who really needed help. he appealed to the heart more than the head. And if I would have a criticism of politics these days, it is that politicians these days tend to appeal to the head, to the pocketbook, to the prejudice, rather than to the conviction and to the heart. And I think if you wish, young people are idealistic. Actually, scratch the British nation and they are idealistic. I know of no other nation in the world in which so many people voluntarily work for charities or good causes for no pay and no recognition. It is one of the great glories of our country that people do that. And it is a form of idealism. And I think to appeal to the idealism of the young, to what can be achieved, to what can be done, I just have a feeling that that would be much more attractive to large numbers of young people than trying simply to produce pocketbook policies that might simply lead to a bidding war between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. I have found that to be so when I've spoken to audiences of young people. They care. It may be that the rough edges of life will reduce their caring and increase their adult cynicism. But when they're young, they do care. Not just for themselves, but for other people. They care for ideas. They care for ideals. And I think we should appeal to that finer nature that is undoubtedly there. And I think we might be surprised. And I think the first politician that learns to appeal above the roar of the media to the British nation and its innate sympathy with so many things that are traditional in this country, including the internationalism that we sometimes forget is part of our heritage, I think the first politician who can find a voice above the babble is someone who will attract an extraordinary amount of support right across the political divide.
I'm going to come to this lady at the back, please.
Hello, Sir John. Please correct me if I'm wrong and if it was Mrs. Thatcher that did this, but I'm just wondering whether one of the U-turns you might be willing to make now is over the legislation to enable colleges to become universities, colleges, polytechnics, because people nowadays are saying that we need more of a diverse approach to further and higher education. Well, we had that 20, 30 years ago.
Yes, we did. Funnily enough, I've been writing a speech about something to do with that over the last few days. The purpose was benevolent in trying to change the nature of colleges. We are still a very class-ridden country. There is still a tendency to think more of the white-collar clerk than the blue-collar engineer. And that is wholly wrong, it seems to me, from my background. And one of the reasons of making the change was to try and lift up the social prestige of the technology colleges. Because what we need in our country, as much as good academic education, is good vocational education. If I were these days in charge of education policy, I would be looking very carefully at going back to something rather similar to the old secondary modern system, where at the age of 14, pupils and their parents would be given a choice of going predominantly down an academic route or predominantly down a vocational route. With the development of robotics and artificial intelligence, the number of white-collar jobs at a modest level is going to diminish and diminish dramatically. But we're still going to need plumbers, we're still going to need engineers, we're still going to need bricklayers, we're still going to need roofers, a whole series of practical, and that is apart from the technological skills we need. And it would be a much better balance to our education system if we had as many vocational colleges as we have academic colleges, and we would be better able to do two things: provide for our own self-interest in the future, and provide people with the skills that are most likely to keep them in employment over the next 30 or 40 years. So I would certainly be looking at that. I think some of the reforms in education at the moment are very good. They're still in their infancy, but I think they're going to work. I've seen a number of these schools, academies, and although one or two haven't been good, most of them have been. But I think you need a revolution in a revolutionary enhancement of vocational education. And the sooner we start that, the better, because we need those skills and people need to acquire those skills. And there was one statistic that struck me very forcibly. A young man or woman who goes to one of our modest universities and comes out with a modest degree, on average will earn £20,000 a year after 5 years. Someone who is a bricklayer will earn £40,000 after 5 years. That is quite a distinct difference. But I think in parallel with the change in the nature and choice of education, we need a social revolution to give people the social respect they need for having those skills. If you go to Germany, no one is more highly regarded than an engineer. If you go to New York, hardly anyone is better paid than a plumber. Try and find a plumber in New York. It's a bit like trying to find a tap in the middle of the Sahara. There aren't many. So we need to prepare people for those sort of jobs.
What would start that social revolution?
Oh, it would have to be government legislation. I mean, if you're going to have that social revolution, you've either got to change the nature of existing schools or build new school shells so that there can be more of them. So you'd firstly have to change the curriculum. You'd secondly have to provide the vocational teachers, and that isn't going to be easy or quick. And then you'd have to provide the premises. And then you'd have to provide a proper system of examinations to make sure that people really have learned those skills. And of course, there'd be different sorts of examinations. So it really is, that's why I called it a revolution. It really is a very substantial change.
Okay, we're going to come to the incredibly patient man over at the back there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to speak to us. I want to speak or ask a question really, which you've touched on a couple of times, which is, you know, I think we have a human need to feel inspired, and you've used the word a couple of times, and yet most of us would not look to politics to be inspired. How do we as a country, how do we as a nation encourage our politicians to be more open? Because you were saying, you know, that often they're really vulnerable behind the scenes, but they have to put on a brave face. And I know that most of us find people that are honest and vulnerable at times inspiring. How do we encourage more of that?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, one of the delights of no longer being a politician is that I don't have to have an answer to every question. And I don't think there is an easy answer to that. It is made, I know what makes it more difficult. It is more difficult because of the nature of the way politics is reported. This isn't just an attack on the media. They have their own problems, and somebody might ask about that later. But the fact of the matter is, you unburden yourself too much. The first time you do it, you get a very sympathetic response. The second time you do it, you're a bird with a wing down. And that's a very quick change of attitude, both by the media and by the public. So it's quite difficult to, I don't know a simple answer to your question. It's a very good question. And I wish I did know the answer, and I will go away and think about it, in the thought that sometime in the next 25 years I might get asked the same question again.
Okay, we're going to head over this way, and then we'll head to the back of the room, please.
Thank you. So John, question, referendum. Was David Cameron right to hold the first referendum? And should we hold a second referendum on the terms of Brexit?
I'm astonished that the subject of Brexit has come up. And I'm awfully sorry my appointments this evening mean I must leave now. I'm not going to retrospectively criticize the referendum. I think the House of Commons did make an error in one respect when they passed the referendum legislation, because don't forget, it was legislation passed by Parliament. Firstly, they didn't set any form of threshold for a substantial constitutional change, or even discuss it, which is rather surprising. And secondly, The public, here is, Europe is one of the most complex issues we have ever faced in this country. And the referendum asked a question that was answered with a simple yes or a simple no. There was no indication of looking at what lay underneath the answer yes or the answer no. The day after within the week of the referendum, after 37% of the public had decided we would leave Europe, there were a number of opinion polls, admittedly fallible, that said that although we were leaving Europe, we should stay in the single market. Now that is contradictory in the view of many people. But then public opinion is contradictory. Public opinion always, if asked, will ask for more public expenditure and lower taxes. So the government were given a very crude answer to the question, because the question didn't allow for any examination of what we might usefully call the subordinate clauses. And of course, that is now causing a great deal of difficulty in policy terms. Now, at the end of all this, when a deal has been finalized, it has to be approved. Now, it will have to go to Parliament to be approved. Parliament have been promised a meaningful vote. Nobody has quite defined what a meaningful vote may mean, but it cannot yet again, surely, it cannot just mean that the legislation is put before the House of Commons and they have to say yes or they have to say no, because the House of Commons is sovereign. The House of Commons can say, we like 2/3 of this, but in these areas we would like you to go back and look again and negotiate again. And the House of Commons will make up its own mind whether it can do that. But it may well be, when it's presented with the case, that it will wish to do so. And where we go from there is uncertain.
Where we go from here is to that lady at the back of the room, and then we're going to come to this gentleman over here, please.
Sir John, what would be your advice to Theresa?
Where are we?
Lady at the back.
Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon.
Sir John, what would be your advice to Theresa May to make the rest of her leadership a success and go down in the history books?
Well, my advice to Theresa May would be in private. And I know that will seem to you to be a cop-out, but I've lived through periods where senior politicians chose to give me advice in public, and it was never helpful. And I think the Prime Minister has enough problems on her hands. I think she could do with some people caring for helping her rather than hindering her. So any advice I have for her, I will give to her privately when next I see her. So I hope you don't think that too much for a cop-out. I do have some clear thoughts upon what she might do, but I think it is better to give them to her than to give them out publicly. Because if I give them publicly and she then follows them, she's criticized by other people for being a puppet of somebody else, for example. You can immediately see the problems she faces. And I wouldn't wish to add to her in-tray of problems, which seems to me at the moment to be quite large enough.
We've already understood it's a ghastly job. Okay, Maggie, over at the back there.
Sir John, you said that the sovereignty lies with the House of Commons. Doesn't sovereignty lie with the people and the decision the people make?
Well, there's a Burkean argument there, isn't there? What was it Burke said to the electors of Bristol South East? You give me your vote, I owe you my judgment. And if you have a referendum, if you regard the people as sovereign, and you have a referendum on everything, which is broadly what the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks do, it is a pretty impossible way to run a country, and a very divisive way too, which is why we vote on a regular basis for whom we wish to represent us in our constituency and who should form a government, and we subcontract to them decisions on our behalf, and that is what we traditionally mean by the sovereignty of Parliament. So it is a semantic argument whether it is the people or Parliament. Of course it's the people because they elect the Parliament, but in electing the Parliament they subcontract the decision-making to people who are there full-time and can examine the details and debate it and what it may mean. Now, I dare say, if I threw open a policy suggestion here, there are 250 people here, we would probably have 240 different responses to it. And that's why we need a Parliament to act for us. And that's what I meant when I referred to the sovereignty of Parliament.
Thank you. We're going to come to the gentleman at the front.
Thank you. So, John, you were in office, I think what I would regard, or a lot of people regard, as possibly the most momentous events of the 20th century, namely the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unification of Germany. I mean, at the time, did it feel as revolutionary as it really was? And reflecting back, how did you regard that particular era? I mean, were you closely involved in it? Were we observers? Were we participants? I mean, it's such an extraordinary event that I think it's interesting to see your perspective.
Yes, it did seem revolutionary change when it happened. The collapse of Germany and the reunification of Germany and the collapse of the Soviet Union ended when I was Foreign Secretary and Chancellor, but I picked up all the pieces, of course, when I became Prime Minister. And we did know that the world had changed. I mean, we British lost an empire by the 1950s, and many would say we haven't got over it yet. Well, the Russians lost an empire in 1989, 1990, and they certainly haven't got over it. It explains a great deal of Putin's present policy. And then there was the reunification of Germany, which was, I think, an inevitability. Many people opposed the reunification of Germany because of the two world wars in the last century. But of course, keeping Germany divided would have kept half of Germany under rigid communist control in East Germany. So I thought the reunification of Germany was an essential component to a free Western Europe and the opportunity to extend the free market across Europe. And I supported it. But we did know they were momentous changes. And there were other momentous changes too. We're here at the China Exchange. What has happened to China in the last 40 years is unprecedented in the history of man. You could not have imagined it. When I first went to China, which was a very long time ago, a brief visit, well, in terms of Hong Kong, I went to work in Hong Kong in the 1960s. So I went across to Shenzhen and other parts of China at that stage. It was almost a different planet compared to today. And now you look at how China has changed, how China has stepped out into the world in a way that I would never have expected to see in my lifetime. And then you look at those extraordinary plans they have for reactivating the old Silk Road right through to Iran. And I would have said those plans were impossible. And then I look at what China has done in the last 40 years, and I no longer say it is impossible, because what we thought was impossible in the past has been achieved. So that is another huge change that we've actually seen. And there were other changes as well. The development of the global market is a relatively new thing. It's very much criticized by some people, by the anti-capitalist League and others. But if you look around the world, the number of people who were illiterate 40 years ago was about 40% of the world. It's now less than 10%. The number of children who would have died of diseases but now do now amounts to 100 million. There are a whole series of changes like that that have been brought about by growing wealth, and the growing wealth is essentially a result of the development of free trade and the global market. So that is another mega change that has occurred in parallel to these other political changes. And we've seen other great political changes recently. The Arab Spring, we thought was going to be quite extraordinary. And there was the hope, a forlorn hope, I fear, as I thought at the time, that it was going to usher in a form of democracy across the Middle East. But of course, the Middle East has no history of Western-style democracy. It's a wholly different concept. And why we should think that we can impose our form of democracy on other countries with a different culture, I've never entirely been sure. And so what has actually happened in the Middle East is we've exchanged one collection of autocrats, by and large, for a different, more modern collection of autocrats. But nonetheless, you can feel the stirring of change across the Middle East. And that is happening at the moment. And there are other changes. I won't go through a whole range of them. Our world is changing at the moment on a scale we have never before known. The world you live in today will be very different by the time your children are your age. And we don't quite know how it will be. But the things I mentioned a few moments ago, artificial intelligence, robotics, things like that, are going to change it beyond anyone's imagination. We could not have imagined the technological changes of the last 20 years, and they are accelerating. This is a moment for H.G. Wells. He could write some extremely good books.
I wonder if he's in the
here
audience.
today.
Let's head for a question over here.
Thank you very much for your time this evening. If you reincarnated, so if you were to have your time again and become a professional cricketer, based on all the players that you've seen, who would you model yourself on from a bowling perspective and a batting perspective?
Well, from a batting perspective, I wouldn't care who it was, providing he could bat number 3. We badly need a number 3 in the England team. Who would I like to be as a bowler? Well, I was brought up watching, because I lived in Brixton, I first went to watch Surrey play at the Oval in 1952, in the middle of a period when Surrey won 7 successive championships with perhaps the greatest county side ever. And the 2 spin bowlers then were Jim Laker and Tony Locke. We badly need a really, really top world-class spin bowler. So I think if I could be a reincarnation of Jim Laker, I think I'd settle for that. And as for a batsman, the finest post-war English batsman, in my view, was Peter May, who also played for Surrey at the same time. So I'd settle for either of those. I don't mind which. I may say someone once asked me a very stupid question. They said, would you prefer to be Prime Minister or Captain of England? I decline to answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, our hour is up. I know, the disappointment is palpable. I'm so sorry. I need to ask you to stay in your seats as Sir John has to get to another engagement, and he's been very kind in fitting us in and the journey to something else. Please stay in your seats, but could those of you who are leaving with him please make your way to the lift now? You know who you are, and there'll be big men to wrestle you to the ground if you try and get in with that group. I'm only slightly exaggerating about the wrestling. Sir John, thank you for a fabulous evening. Would you please join me in thanking Sir John May?